Greetings there, everyone. It's Gary Dag here from Capabuild. I hope you are excited about the next hour of learning here with the Capabuild team. We have some more pollev questions for you this week. A reminder that it's very important for you and for us to answer these questions so that we can understand the way you are thinking, your ideas, and to get your feedback for the question and answer session that's coming up this week. So when asked to do so during the video, can you please pause and go to pollev.com/Capabuild, and that will actually be in the description of your YouTube video. So if you press pause, it will be down below that link, and then click on Start the Survey and answer the questions that and polls and different feedback mechanisms that we have. Thank you.
COVID-19 has brought disruption to the globalized and interconnected world.
The challenges of COVID have led to a dark period, both in terms of human suffering, but also the damage done to our political and social fabric.
But before the pandemic, globalization was already in retreat. Now, that trend looks set to accelerate.
This is a diminished world in many ways that we're looking at. It's a world of globalization.
From smartphones to toys, today's globalized trading system has grown to rely on long and complex supply chains. But the pandemic has played havoc with them. Clothing is one industry that has been hit hard. Worth $2.5 trillion globally, it employs over 43 million people in Asia alone.
One of the most footloose industries when it comes to supply chain has always been the garment industry. That's because it has a high level of human involvement. And so the labor cost of a product is much higher than you might find in an automobile, for example. For that reason, we've always seen companies chase the lowest cost.
That means manufacturing mostly happens in Asia, and the global nature of the industry makes it especially vulnerable to disruptions. Take a typical pair of trousers sold on a high street in Western Europe. The label says made in Bangladesh, but many of the parts come from other countries. Chinese factories making buttons and zips shut during the pandemic, meaning the items didn't reach their next port. Factories in Bangladesh couldn't finish the trousers and cancelled orders to cotton suppliers in India. And lockdown hit demand in the West, as customers weren't shopping on high streets. In America, clothing sales fell by 73.5% between March and April this year. Bangladesh lost out on an estimated $3.2 billion from cancelled exports in just 6 months.
আমরা এখন খুব খারাপ অবস্থার মধ্যে আছি চাকরি না থাকলে আমরা রুম ভাড়া দিতে পারবো না খাইতে পারবো না
And across Asia, millions of low-income workers were laid off. Goods taking long journeys from factory to the high street have become one of the signatures of globalization. The roots of today's heavily globalized world were put down at the end of the Second World War. The Allied nations created a rules-based system for international commerce and finance.
Designed to establish the economic foundations of peace on the bedrock of genuine international cooperation.
This allowed companies, products, science and technology to move across borders. Then, in the 1990s, the world entered an era of hyper-globalization, becoming more interconnected than ever before.
The dream of money.
我们当然要在当前的 WTO 面临的危机当中发挥我们的作用。
In this era, the big new player on the scene was China, which joined the World Trade Organization. It grew to dominate global trade alongside the United States. Multinational companies thrived, expanding into China and all over the globe. From 1990 to 2008, the total trade in goods and services increased from 39% to 61% of world GDP. This great globalization boom enabled 1 billion people in developing countries to lift themselves out of poverty, and in the West, consumers enjoyed cheaper and more accessible travel and goods. COVID-19 struck a major blow to unfettered globalization. But before the pandemic arrived, globalization had already taken 2 other big hits.
The American financial system is rocked to its foundation.
Japanese stocks down 9%, the Hong Kong market's down.
Everywhere you look, the colour is red, and no one, it seems, can stop the bleeding.
The first was the 2008 financial crisis, when cross-border investment, trade, bank loans and supply chains shrank. Globalization started to slow down, a process known as slowbalization.
The global financial crisis a decade ago was perhaps an early sign of the beginnings of slowbalization. It wasn't recognized as such at the time because it seemed to be a banking crisis.
The global economy suffered, and those who had already lost out during the heyday of globalization felt even poorer. Opposition to this system grew.
And we see this kind of sentiment across Western democracies to bring the jobs back that were stolen when the factories moved, particularly to China. Those who were left behind very cruelly by the policies and people that supported globalization, that is, the blue-collar workers, for example, in factories in northern England or in the Midwest of America, the Trump voters.
This desire to revive manufacturing and bring back dignity to workers spread across the Western world. A wave of populist leaders were elected across the globe, championing nationalist policies, attacking immigration and the existing global economy.
Ho firmato 2 divieti d'ingresso nelle acque italiane a 2 ONG straniere cariche di centinaia di immigrati.
The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots.
Free trade went out of fashion, and protectionism was all the rage. The number of trade interventions, such as tariffs and subsidies, introduced by countries has been increasing year on year. And while some have brought liberalization, most have been harmful to world trade. In this climate, globalization suffered a second assault.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing.
A trade war blew up between the world's 2 largest economies. For years, the West had accused China of flouting WTO rules, saying its trading practices were unfair to Western companies. But President Trump turned rhetoric into policy. Since the start of his presidency, tariffs on Chinese exports to the US have increased 6-fold. China hit back, more than doubling its tariffs on US goods. The advent of the pandemic this year was the 3rd big disruption to globalization within the last 12 years. Slowbalization has sped up. This year, the IMF forecasts that global GDP could fall by 4.9%. That is 50 times more than in 2009. The post-COVID world is likely to be a more fractured and regionalized one.
What we saw for 20, 30 years with unfettered global trade, with unfettered global travel, with sourcing from China serving the world, I think we'll never go back to that. What we're likely to see is a messier world in future, one with elements of globalization continuing, but many other countertrends that lead to either regionalization, nationalization, localization, some form of deglobalization. And so we're going to a spiky world. We're going to see much more disruption.
As multinationals try to navigate the challenges of the pandemic, the talk in the boardroom is increasingly about how to be less global and more local.
They have seen how vulnerable their supply chains are to unanticipated disruption of a natural kind. For the first time at the level of the CEO and the board, companies are discussing supply chain risk and what to do about it and how to insure against it. Now they're seeing this as something vital to the business.
Some companies are ahead of the game. The Spanish clothing retailer Zara is one of the most successful in the clothing industry, and its shorter supply chains have helped the company weather the COVID storm. While most Western high street fashion brands have offshored manufacturing to Asia, where labor is cheaper, distance equals time. So retailers have to bulk order 6 months in advance, and in that time, a lot can go out of fashion. Zara keeps its manufacturing base closer to home for its higher fashion lines, meaning it can take a design to the high street in a matter of weeks. That way it doesn't stockpile inventory and can respond quickly to consumer trends.
That model is coming to not just to fashion, but industry after industry is going to move in that direction, in part because the on-demand economy is allowing us to express our tastes through social commerce. We've seen a revolution that's driven both by fear of disruption on one hand, but also by the opportunities created by the internet economy.
The pandemic has disrupted the movement of goods, people, and capital around the globe. But even without COVID-19, another pillar of globalization would be facing challenges. The flow of data across borders. The Great Firewall of China has kept out the likes of Google and Facebook for years. And President Trump's recent attacks on TikTok and WeChat are deepening this splinter net between China and the West.
We're looking at TikTok. We may be banning TikTok.
And it's not just software.
We confronted untrustworthy Chinese technology and telecom providers. We convinced many countries, and I did this myself for the most part, not to use Huawei.
The decoupling of Chinese and American tech also extends to hardware.
I think this is likely to lead to two worlds, a China-dominated world and an America-dominated world on technology and software, and ultimately we will have less innovation.
The unpicking of globalization may accelerate on a number of fronts, irrespective of when COVID-19 is brought under control. And this could be bad news for developing countries such as India. The globalization boom allowed countries in Southeast Asia to rise to middle-income status. But the likes of India may miss out on this.
There is a concern that we may see a leapfrogging in countries that are emerging. The way that China had a chance to put its massive population to work in factories, there is a worry that for developing countries that are just emerging at that stage, that the world may move to a post-industrial economy and leave them behind. This is a genuine concern.
And they are not the only people who stand to lose out from deglobalization. In rich countries like the US and Britain, those most in favor of reining in globalization could suffer the most.
We're going to London to stop the Brexit betrayal. Good morning.
Economic nationalism will not prove to be a silver bullet.
It's very likely that policies of deglobalization or economic nationalism that try to bring the factories back will discover that you can bring the factories back, but you can't bring the jobs back. That's because when the factories are brought back, almost always they will be more highly automated than they were in China.
But even as the world becomes more deglobalized, some of the biggest winners from globalization will endure. Big digital companies like Netflix, Google, and Facebook will keep getting bigger. With the pandemic accelerating the trend towards shopping online, companies following the Amazon model of fast, direct delivery will also do well.
The top 10%, even in the worst sectors, worst meaning hardest hit sectors, could well emerge with a winning business model. I think in every crisis you find some companies that fall behind, and those that are fundamentally able to rejig their business models and innovate are the ones that thrive.
In the post-COVID world, some aspects of globalization affected by the pandemic may shift back, such as freedom to travel. The world has grown too integrated for a full unwinding of globalization. COVID will not kill it off. It will deepen the cracks. However, this may not be all bad news.
I'm hopeful that we'll learn the right lessons that we need to make our societies more resilient, so that we don't resort to very simple solutions that don't work, like shut down the supply chain, build a wall, keep the immigrants out. We've tried those things before. I think the broader solution is to make interdependence work with resilience. That's the challenge that global leaders face today. I'm Vijay Vaideswaran, U.S. business editor of The Economist. If you'd like to find out more about the topic of the pandemic and the global economy, click on the link opposite. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.
Welcome back. This is again an exciting day because we now move from visioning to actually doing. What can we do in terms of policy and advocacy in the digital economy and tax? We would like you to answer 2 questions now in pollev. This is the hyperlink as explained before. Please answer question 1, then press next. Then answer question 2 and press next. Leave the tab open and return to YouTube. Thank you. Prakasa workshop on digital economy. Today we talk about policy and advocacy. That's an exciting topic. I am here with Paul de Haan, the co-founder of Capabuild. And my name is Gitte Heij and I am the chair of the executive board of Capabuild. Capabuild very much focuses on tax training centers in low-income countries. But as we said last week, tax is not an island, and therefore we gladly present together with those stakeholders who have an interest in tax. And there are many. To start with, we have of course big tech, and that is very big and actually determines quite a lot in terms of policy. We see the rise of big tech from the US, but also from China. Paul, do you want to say something about this part?
Yeah, if we look at the old and the new, sure, for Europe, it's considered, some call Europe a museum, so it's not taken that seriously anymore. And partly they are true, because it's so-called the old continent. But on the other hand, the concept of European Union as a European single market is, I think it can be seen as one big, huge experiment, and as such it is very fascinating to follow. And I think it would be very wise for people in Africa and Asia and Latin America to have a look how things were structured and done with this European single market. Again, I think I'm not saying it is a best practice. In many instances, you could say it's a bad practice, but I think other countries and other continents can learn from the European experience. So
yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah. And then we see the new ones that are not in the museum, so to speak. And then we look at BRICS, for example, and we look, of course, at China, India. We look at Indonesia. They are really the upcoming economies that will take over.
I think if I may interrupt, Gitte, I think if you the fact that since let's say Deng Xiaoping, the former Chinese, introduced more liberal elements in the Chinese society, so forming the Chinese state capitalism, so to speak, and then have an economic growth of yearly 10% that is unbelievable. I think the Chinese miracle has been unbelievable, strong. And recently, and we shared that earlier this week, Gitte and I, that it now seems that the Chinese economy is back on track again. I mean, after the Corona crisis, it is back on track again. And there will be a lot of people say, well, you don't have to believe those figures by China, but I think it is impressive. Really
I
impressive.
agree. I agree. And China is actually one of the few countries that's doing well out of this COVID crisis. And you actually mentioned before that the financial crisis had clear leadership, and that you felt the COVID crisis has not demonstrated real leadership, also not from China.
Well, can you imagine? I mean, if you look at the financial crisis 2008, I can understand it, or I remember vividly that reading books that, for instance, Hank Paulson, the US Treasury around that time in the deep crisis. By the way, he came from Goldman Sachs, and he did the Chinese market. He spoke Chinese. He was in permanent dialogue with the Chinese leaders. And I cannot imagine President Trump speaking Chinese and talking to his Chinese counterparts on a weekly basis. So there was a lot of discussion and debate among all the G20 leaders, and there is absolutely no sign of that in an even worse crisis, the COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah, that's so true. I so agree. And then we haven't even talked about things like the global warming, the climate crisis. And again, we see a lack of leadership. We see the same in some ways with growing inequality, that we know it's there and we know how serious this is, but we do not see one particular body showing real good leadership.
And we included in our presentation a clip by The Economist on globalization, which I think is very illustrative.
Yeah, indeed. What happens if actually globalization is slowing down and we see a more inward-looking economic activity? And we have here quite a provocative question, and that is, do we trust the OECD, and should we? And we have, of course, the painful question all the time: who really sets the rules?
It's an interesting discussion, Gitte. If you look at there are quite some people who would be saying that a multilateral tax solution should be done within the framework of the United Nations. But personally, I think the level of expertise within the OECD is mind-boggling, and I know even the UN itself doesn't seem to be that keen to take over the role, because the international tax arena is at the moment crisis and chaos, and you must be crazy to really volunteer right now and step in and say, well, I will do this, because at the end of the day, I think it's not a tax technical question, it's politics. And the OECD proved in the past decades to be a very good expert organization, and also they had I think the OECD has the talent to transform political questions into tax technical questions. I mean, they were brilliant at that. But at the moment, with the crisis in the digital economy and the tax treatment of that, and the let's say the increasing pressures in the global system, like between US and China, I think the OECD is I would be very surprised if if they are able to reach a consensus on the digital economy and the tax treatment thereof, I think the chances are less than 5%.
Wow, I tend to agree with you. I think that is, but then the question is, I think the United Nations may not have the technical expertise, but is very experienced, of course, in how to deal with political questions and how to navigate that or lack thereof due to not being able to come to a joint viewpoint. And I think that's really lacking here. You see, the OECD has a lot of technical experts, and to translate that into political action is something else than the other way around.
You would have to take the political credibility of the OECD, of the United Nations, and combine it with the efficiency and the effectiveness of the OECD, and then come up with a third institute who could combine that all.
Oh,
a
that's
two-headed monster.
This we have a question mark here. What could that be? How could we connect the two? And that's something we'll look at in a moment. First, we have not seen complete failures. Of course, we see some success in BEPS. Would you agree?
Yeah. As Pascal Saint-Amand said on his birthday past 12th October, the glass is half full and half empty. And I think he's right. It's half full and half empty.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is very, very difficult, of course, because the US plays such an enormous role within the OECD, and it makes it so much harder to resolve the outstanding issues.
I recall that when I was still active in the trenches, so to speak, with PwC, I can recall the end of the 90s, beginning 2000, when there was this enormous internet bubble, and end of the 90s, all tax authorities all over the world were really so scared that the digital economy, that the internet would destroy all domestic tax bases. So they asked, even then, I think it was 98 or something, they asked the OECD to step in. And at that time, I think there was an excellent opportunity to change the global tax system, because let's say it evolves around the arm's length principle and the separate entity approach. So rather than taking a multinational as one unit, global unit, you break it down in little separate legal entities, and then you apply the arm's length principle, and you pretend that all those separate legal entities do not belong to the same group,
yes.
Which is nowadays a very idiotic starting point. But okay, the US loves the arm's length principle because, and I may be a bit cheeky here, but it is in favor of the resident states. So I think the arm's length principle really helps the richer countries, the rich residence countries, to allocate more profit to their tax bases. Then, for instance, a unitary taxation with formula apportionment, where you take the company as a whole and then allocate along the lines of employees, number of employees, sales, what have you, which I think would result in a larger portion of the global profit to be allocated to, let's say, the market jurisdictions and the developing countries.
Yes.
But they missed that opportunity.
Yeah,
and I think did. And at that time, the global structure, the global infrastructure was still in place. It was working. It was creating a lot of inequality, but it was working. And now to get a consensus on the digital economy, I think it's nearly impossible.
Yeah, it is. It is. I know, and that brings us to like we see that the US has done some domestic tax reform that may actually be quite helpful. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and I always thought that funny or strange or weird or silly that the BEPS project was to a large extent to deal with aggressive tax planning. But I think it's fair to say that let's say 75% of all the aggressive tax planning came from US companies with the support, implicit or explicit support, of the US government. I may be getting a bit technical here, but if you look at the check the box rules, every US president so far maintained those check the box rules, which makes it very easy for US companies to shift their profits outside the US and keep those profits outside the US and get a favorable ruling outside the US and have the non-US profit taxed at a very low tax rate. Well, the Apple is I think a very big example where the bulk of or every US profit was more or less allocated to Ireland. Ireland did not tax it. And as long as those profits were not redistributed into the US, Apple would not pay any tax on that. So I think the main driver behind aggressive tax planning was the US tax law, and especially the US international tax law. And the change, the US tax reform, really removed that and removed, as we said here, removed the main driver behind tax planning. So BEPS did a good thing, like it increased transparency, but the US tax reform took away, I think, a lot of the drivers behind aggressive tax planning. And you can see that businesses now, let's say, there is an increasing awareness that in order to be a good taxpayer or in order to be a good citizen, also a firm, a multinational needs to have its tax governance in order as well. So I think there is an increasing awareness around business that you cannot see tax as a simple cost item. It is a price you pay for a good and responsible society, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is, and we coming back to the BEPS, we also see that NGOs and the media have been very successful in creating better dialogue and to get issues on the agenda around BEPS. I think they did that really well, and we see, as you say, that business is becoming more and more aware of fair tax governance, and they want certainty above all. We hear this all the time in our workshops and from our private industry donors. They want certainty, and they are not, when they don't get it, they really prefer certainty over a lower tax rate maybe at the end, because they can't plan. And I think that's really, when we look at ways forward, now particularly in COVID times, we see that nations need to rapidly increase tax revenue. So what do? And that's where indirect taxes are so tempting, because it's simple, it's straightforward, it rarely causes the friction with the society to introduce it, because those who collect are not the ones who pay. And we see more, and I think you and I agree on this, we see a disappearance of direct taxes that become so complex and have become so eroded, and there's so much uncertainty that it's almost not worth it. At least we see this in high income countries increasingly, that the share of tax revenue from direct taxes is actually going down.
Yeah,
and that brings us, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and the complexities are enormous. I mean, if you need around 2,000 pages to explain the arm's length principle and digital economy, I mean...
Yeah, who wants that? No one wants that. And that leads us to the second part of this talk, and that is, when we look forward, we can't just say we disagree with the OECD or we think there are problems with the current approach by the OECD, but we need to look at different scenarios that are not totally unlikely that they might happen. And this is something we do quite a lot in Capabuild when we do training, that we say, but what if? Imagine globalization is not continuing and we see more and more industries moving back to their home country and using more automated processes to manufacture. What does that mean for a country, and what does that mean for the participants in this workshop when they promote certain tax approaches in their country, but actually some of the manufacturers may have gone home to Europe or to the US, and this strategy may not work. Or another thing is, imagine, we touched on that, income tax, corporate tax disappears. What will replace it? These are things we all need to think about. And we now look very much at the US and we look at Europe, but who are the big players in 10 years' time, and how would they conduct these negotiations? What is their point of view? And who will be powerful and who will no longer be that powerful? And I think these, and another thing is the rise of indirect taxes that we see over and over again. And we cannot ignore that. This is really happening. And imagine now with deglobalization that domestic taxes become actually a lot more important than they are currently, or they were in the past, because of the withdrawal of international companies. And what can we do about that? What can we as an organization, I mean, Capabuild is in the same position as many organizations that the participants represent here, and that is what our approach is one approach, and we invest very much in sharing knowledge and expertise, particularly how would private industry look at something, how would governments look at something, what are the technical details you need to be aware of, how do you negotiate a tax agreement, do you want a tax agreement, to step back, maybe it's overrated, or you mentioned transfer pricing issues and arm's length principles. These are agendas that are really pushed by certain countries, and suddenly you see them on a program in a low-income country where it may actually not be that relevant. And we believe in a permanent dialogue with our international tax stakeholders, very much so. So we work with the different players from private industry, from civil society, from government, but it depends indeed on the views of the organization that the participants represent. Paul, you had something to say about it, that you felt it was very important to have a unified view. Am I right there?
Well, I think you need to be. I mean, if there is chaos, if there is crisis, then everything is on the table. I mean, there is no. So you have to think in various scenarios. I think clearly you would have to, let's say, a one big unified systemic approach. We need a new system, and you need to think about it. Like, for instance, you can advocate the unitary taxation approach with formula apportionment, who would replace the current arm's length principle. You see something of that clearly in the Pillar 1 proposal of the OECD, where you really look at the global profit of a global player, so to speak. On the other hand, if you look at the domestic side, I had here in the Netherlands, we have a very interesting example. Within a certain technical rule, there was a possibility of let's say, we call it the liquidation loss arrangement. This arrangement was typically included in the law because of big business. And they did a very good lobbying, well, I'll say 30, 40 years ago, and that rule was included. And now you can see there was a small leftish party, political party in the Netherlands, in Dutch Parliament. They worked together with some tax professors, and they made a proposal for let's say, to amend the legislation and to get rid of the liquidation loss rule. In any case, make it less attractive. It was more or less a present, I think, to big business. And they were successful in doing that. So, on the one hand, you have the unified approach, which needs to be flexible because things change by the day at the moment, and there is no real solid foundation to work with. On the other hand, you can see on a domestic or on a regional basis, tax is, and that's the good news, maybe the only good news I'm having, but tax is on top of the agenda. Politically, tax is hot. And so I think by moving in a let's say, also having a piecemeal approach, step by step, you can be successful, I think, in defending and proposing all kinds of smaller rules which are of big importance, domestically or regionally.
Yeah, that is indeed one of the other things to say. Can you form coalitions? You know, can you alliances with other stakeholders? And one new stakeholder on the block is FACTI, that came out of the United Nations and has just published a great report. And FACTI, although affiliated with the United Nations, funded by Norway, it leaves the door open to combine certain different views and to work together with those who have similar views. And I think we need lots of new ideas. We ideally unified approach, but that's hard. And we need new ideas like FACTI. What I like about FACTI is that it's so realistic. It's very realistic, and I think we need that. We can't just have for any of us to say we don't like what we see, but we have no alternative. We need to come up with the alternatives. We both believe the OECD proposals have a very low chance of succeeding. So what's the alternative? And what can governments do and what can NGOs do in this space? And I think we haven't explored, we need new views instead of letting the agenda be set by the OECD and then say we don't like it. We need to do better than that. We need ideas like the FACTI report has, and we discussed this earlier in the week ourselves about, can we actually have clauses in tax assessment submissions that actually say, in all tax accounting and on certain tax positions, it is assumed that all tax authorities have full knowledge of all facts and circumstances. In other words, you make people responsible if they don't give you the full picture. And that there is a link that CEOs, board members, accountants actually are held responsible if that doesn't happen, and criminal action may follow. Instead of what happens now a lot is that you just hope for the best, and if you get caught, unlucky. If you don't, life's great. There are better ways of doing that. There must be more ideas out there, and we really look forward to hear that from the audience as well, that we say, okay, what do you propose we can do in this situation? We have a clip in this program of Rutger Bregman, who has very successfully used social media to get this point across in terms of the billionaires not paying a lot of tax. And what else can we do in this space? And I hope during the panel discussion we are able to elaborate further on that. And when people fill in the pollev questions that are anonymous, we are after new ideas instead of saying no to the old ideas. And that is a lot harder. And we look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Gitte. And thank the audience.
Thank you all.
Great.
And we're back in pollev. We would like you to answer question 3, then press next, and then answer question 4 and press next. Then back to YouTube. Leave this tab open. Thank you.
The interim report published today reflects the outcomes of the first phase of a panel's work. It addresses the first half of our mandate, which is to review the existing mechanisms, frameworks, and institutions. Identified the major gaps in the international legal and institutional frameworks for financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. While there are many sub-areas to explore, the panel chose to cluster our work into 3 main topics from the very, very beginning. The first topic is about cooperation in tax matters. The second topic is about accountability, reporting, and anti-corruption. And the third topic is about international cooperation and settling disputes. Each one relates to all the others, and a weak link can undermine all parts in the system. Overall, we find that the drain on resources due to insufficient financial integrity has been an impediment to achieving the 2030 agenda. The overarching determination we have made is that the gaps in the current system are not isolated. They represent systemic shortcomings in the current arrangements. They require then systemic responses. A weak spot can undermine the whole system, allowing resources to be drained. An improved international system can help countries to address the interlinked challenges. It is necessary for the international community to come together with a shared diagnosis of the system. Better global coordination is required. We need inclusive and sustainable participation by all nations, both from North and South At this moment in time, member states need to show willingness to agree on new solutions. Excellencies, today's report also represents just the midpoint of a panel's work. Without a doubt, the work will not get easier. There are potential opportunities to transform the international financial system so that it better aligns with achievement of the SDGs. Each existing institution and framework provides a basis for further action. Our aim is clear. The panel is ready to contribute an ambitious but achievable set of recommendations that could make a major difference in achieving collective global goals. The interim report indicates some suggested path to reach this common destination. But the FACTI panel cannot walk the path alone. We must work with all of you. Leaders in government, public servants in the private sector, especially in the financial sector and the professions in the media, the civil society, all must play a critical role in ensuring that resources serve to contribute to our global agenda rather than being drained away. Member states need to show willingness to agree on new solutions. I hope this will be the start of a shared journey. In the next phase of our work, the panel will further explore recommendations with technically feasible and politically viable solutions. We are ready for engagement with all stakeholders. Please come to us with ideas and willingness to work on new or creative solutions.
Here we are. Question 5 and 6 in pollev. Would you answer question 5 and press next? Then answer question 6, press next, and continue watching the YouTube. Thank you.
Look, no, thank you very much. I think the challenges that Rebecca speaks of are real, and we have to recognize that the relationships in civil society are imbalanced. And again, if we want to walk the talk on sort of our values, we have to be conscious of that imbalance and work to make sure that we're being as inclusive and accountable as possible. I think and in terms of collaboration that Juliana just raised, I think there is, so the wonderful thing for me about civil society is its diversity, and we have to play to that strength. There will be some of us who will need to work very closely with government to delivering shared outcomes, but there also needs to be some of us who stand far apart from government to challenge governments and others, power holders, when they are behaving badly or letting us down. And, to me, the civil society is at its best when we work together very effectively in synergy, complementing each other, sometimes in our own organizations. And let me just say, for Oxfam, being such a relatively large and also old network, we do this often at the same time. And we've been doing this since our very beginning. I mean, we were founded by 8 volunteers in Oxford in the United Kingdom in 1942 during the Second World War. People were upset that the British government was stopping food from going through the Nazi blockade to Greece, which was experiencing a famine. And those 8 people, who were just citizens, decided to do 2 things. They raised money and sent money to the Greek Red Cross to buy food for food relief for those people starving. But they also began a campaign to challenge the UK government on why it was using this policy that was leading to humanitarian suffering. And that duality has been there throughout our history of being both delivering important things to end or relieve poverty, but also changing the system, changing policy, speaking truth to power. Now, in our organization, we do that within our system, but in a wider civil society ecosystem, I think we need to do both. And
And in some ways, I use that story of 1942 because, of course, in those days, this was long before we had invented the word, over official development assistance and the aid system and the development industrial complex. We were, at our founding, and for many decades after that, a part of community development, if you will, volunteers coming together to help each other and make change in the world. And, in some ways, it's fantastic that some bits of civil society have become much more, much bigger, more institutionalized, more global. But that's great because we need strong, global institutions. But we also need, for every one of us, we need thousands or millions of other different types of civic formations. And really importantly, we have to work together in that journey and be mutually accountable. And I hope that's the journey that Oxfam is on. And I'd love to stay in touch. If you have any ideas or suggestions, I'd love to receive them. And thank you very much again, John.
Thank you for making it all the way. These are the last two questions in pollev. Would you please answer question 7 and press next? Then answer question 8, the final question, and press submit. Then you can return to YouTube and watch the final part of our recordings. Thank you.
This week, we're leading with one of those topics that television news producers would rather leave to print journalists, or better yet, authors, because it's complicated. It's about tax rates, and it's not a sexy topic, not a visual story, until a young Dutch academic spoke at the recent World Economic Forum in Davos and made news by telling a room full of billionaires, want to fix the global economy? Then dig deeper, pay up. It's time to tax the rich. Then Fox News' Tucker Carlson invited Rutger Bregman onto his program. Mistake. Bregman went right after Carlson, the channel that he works for, and the media in general for almost never covering the fundamental issue of tax reform. It's fair to say that Carlson did not take it particularly well. The interview would not go to air, but Bregman managed to have the entire exchange recorded on a phone camera. And once he sent it to Now This, an online news site, it was destined to go viral and get people talking. Our starting point this week is tax avoidance, global inequality, and the complicity of big media. The format is what's known as a double-ender, or a DTL, a down-the-line interview, which means the host is in one place, Tucker Carlson, at Fox News' headquarters in New York, the guest in another, Rutger Bregman, in a studio in Amsterdam. And it was pre-recorded. It wasn't live.
Rutger Bregman is the author of Utopia for Realists, and he joins us now.
Typically, if that kind of interview goes wrong, and the channel chooses not to air it, the video never sees the light of day, because it exists on the broadcaster's server and nowhere else.
I mean, you're probably not gonna air this.
But this one went viral, obtained and released by the online site Now This. Because in addition to showing up with an agenda, Bregman had a plan. He brought along a friend to record the video from the Amsterdam end on his phone and to capture the audio from both ends.
It is a bit hypocritical, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
He knew that it was probably never going to be broadcast because he was raising issues that hurt them and make them look pretty bad.
You've been part of the Cato Institute, right? You've been taking their dirty money.
He was criticising the fact that they are paid to represent a particular kind of ideology.
You're a millionaire funded by billionaires, and that's the reason why you're not talking about these issues.
What you got is the classic car crash TV interview, and I think that made him uncomfortable as well. But I think the thing that made him most uncomfortable was that he was accused of not being an independent journalist, that he was accused of working to a greater ideology that was also his paymaster.
I mean, many people have called for higher taxes, but very few
Well, not on this channel, is it? I mean, almost all of the pundits on this channel for years have been against higher taxes, right?
He didn't like that. He took umbrage with that.
You're all like, oh, I'm against the globalist elite, blah, blah, blah. It's not very convincing, to be honest.
Why don't you go yourself, you tiny brain, and I hope this gets picked up.
Even 20 years ago, this would have been unthinkable.
The very fact that Bregman was able to get it out so quickly is itself a sign of the ability of different voices sometimes to break into the narrative and interrupt dominant interpretations of issues like, say, taxing the wealthy.
I mean, I don't know.
The down-the-line interview between New York and Amsterdam actually got its start in Switzerland. Rutger Bregman made waves in Davos, telling the World Economic Forum's well-heeled audience that the best way to fix the global economy was to hit them in the pocket and hard.
Come on, we gotta be talking about taxes. That's it, taxes, taxes, taxes.
However, Fox and Carlson would have been more interested in something else Bregman told his audience of billionaires, an observation that happened to square with Fox's own ideology.
I mean, 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet.
Perhaps Carlson's producers thought that Bregman would be a kindred spirit regarding the hypocrisy of billionaires flying halfway across the world. But Bregman doesn't come at this from that kind of position at all, the kind of conservative populist position that maybe Tucker Carlson or Fox News does.
But for me, what really stood out from that interview was the moment when Rutger accused Tucker Carlson of being a millionaire funded by billionaires.
You're not part of the solution, Mr. Carlson. You're part of the problem, actually.
That, for me, went to the heart of this debate about the role that media and well-paid people within the media potentially contribute to the debate or the lack thereof around tax fairness.
You're a moron. I tried to give you a hearing, but you were too annoying for me.
You can't handle the criticism, can you?
In Money Watch, a new report says the U.S. will fall.
The coverage of tax reform in mainstream news media is disproportionately low, while tax avoidance gets sporadic mentions when celebrities from the world of sports or entertainment are involved. Those advocating reform, like Rutger Bregman, tend to blame corporate media and the ideology of their owners for the shortfall. But the truth is a little more complicated than that, a little less reductive. Some of the media's aversion to tax stories, even corporate-owned media, isn't ideological, it's commercial. Channels not wanting to lose viewers by testing their patience and burying them in numbers, documents, deductions, credits, and loopholes.
You're right that reporting on tax can be dry and it can be boring. And 95% of that work involves reading very complicated spreadsheets, financial statements, and emails that don't make much sense. I do think that television has gotten much better, and there have been great examples at reporting on things like the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. If reporting on tax and financial crimes has taught me anything, it's that patience is a virtue.
I think by and large economic stories run pretty well on television. We have news walls, we have discussion programs. Remember that if you're talking about taxation, you're also talking about inequality, you're talking about poverty, you're talking about real people's lives. All that can be represented on television. I think what's happening at the moment is outlier ideas like radical taxation across the board.
Taxing labor income less. And taxing large accumulated wealth a bit more.
These were outlier ideas only a couple of years ago, but they're starting to take root now. And perhaps the media is having to rethink where it allocates space and time to those kind of discussions.
Commercial considerations are not the only thing the tax reform story is up against. Corporate ideology preaches that low tax rates are a good thing. That if billionaires are spared taxes proportionate to their income, society will somehow benefit. That's debatable. But what does trickle down is the trope that starts on the executive floor and winds its way below to the newsroom, where it becomes a journalistic truism, whether it is true or false.
For example, if a government cuts taxes, it will lead to increased economic growth. There is no evidence for that. And yet it's repeated as though it's true. It's not challenged.
The cut is a great thing because businesses, small and large, will owe less to the federal robber barons and be able to do as they see fit with their newfound hard-earned cash.
The problem with the media really is that there has been an ideological capture and There is a kind of narrative that has become dominant. And one of the successes of neoliberalism is its invisibility and the fact that people are not aware, including journalists, are not aware that they're repeating beliefs that have no evidential basis.
Is there a cultural difference between mainstream media and the sort of voices we're now seeing in the general public and on the internet? Yes, there probably is. I think the media is only now coming to terms with the fact that people are challenging more bravely the status quo that even 5 years ago in a forum like Davos would not have been mentioned.
It's not a coincidence that in every project that we at ICOJ have done, be it Swiss Leaks, Panama Papers or Paradise Papers, there is a pretty substantial number of media moguls, television station owners, newspaper owners, magazine owners, who appear, surprise, surprise, as using tax havens, as having secretive bank accounts. So the question is significant. Is there a way in which that economic pressure leads perhaps to the distortion of media coverage?
The better question may be, is there any way it doesn't?
This is my first time at Davos.
Rutger Bregman has recently made waves at two institutions, one a gathering of the rich and powerful, the other a news network.
I went to Davos to speak truth to power, and I'm doing exactly the same thing right now. But you're a millionaire funded by billionaires, and that's the reason why you're not talking about these issues.
Bregman made news by stating the obvious, that the rich should pay their fair share. Because sometimes it's not what you say that matters, it's where you say it. But the last word on this goes to the millionaire Fox News anchor who went viral. 15 million views and counting.
And I hope this gets picked up. I hope this gets picked up.
He didn't really mean that.